Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Today's subject is a very famous Hungarian cardinal, József Mincenty, who became kind of a symbol of Hungarian resistance to communism and of Catholic resistance to communism around the world, especially in the 1960s and 70s. The reason I wanted to talk about him is Catholic University of America Press just put out a translation of a sort of definitive Hungarian language biography of him titled Victim of History. The author of that is Margit Balog, and it was translated by Andrew Gain. But CUA Press was nice enough to put me in touch with another Mincenty scholar, my guest today, Arpad von Klimo. And he is a professor of history at the Catholic University of America and the author of a number of books and other publications on Hungarian history. So I'm very happy to welcome Arpad von Klimo to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe you can give me a little bit of background on your own interest in Hungarian history as someone born in Germany yourself.
Well, one thing that's important, of course, is my father, who was Hungarian, who fled after World War II. My mother's German, but so there was always the Hungarian connection in my family. I started my career with a dissertation on Italian history, so my interest in Hungarian history came later. It also has to do with the German university system. In order to become professor, it has changed in the meantime, but you used to have 2 books on very different topics, different time periods, different geography. So after my dissertation on Italy, I did another study on Hungarian history, and that also had to do with my father passed away in 1990, and he didn't teach us Hungarians, so we had a kind of broken relationship with Hungary. It was a country far away and kind of behind the Iron Curtain, because I grew up in Heidelberg in the west of Germany. I served in the German army during the Cold War, the 1980s, for 2 years. So Hungary was kind of unknown to me. And then the first time I visited was 1988, just before the fall of communism, and I got to know my aunt, who is a very important person in my life. She was a wonderful Catholic, and she passed away in 2003. The other part of my family, including my father's side, was Lutheran. Okay, this is not completely related to, but it is to the topic, because one side of my family, the male side, was always Lutheran until at least since the 18th, 17th century. And the other, the female part, in my Hungarian family, they were mostly Catholics. In the Habsburg Empire, there was this rule that the male children would be following the confession of the father. Female children would follow the confession of the mother. So if you had a Catholic mother, then the girls of the family would all be raised Catholic. The boys Protestant if the father was Protestant. That was the case in our family. And I mean, my aunt was very important because I converted because I was raised as a Lutheran, but later on I converted to Catholicism, and one reason was why I did that was also the wonderful example of my aunt. So my father's sister, who stayed in Hungary after 1945, I think she was a wonderful person, and what was interesting about her, she was a silent Catholic. She never talked about being a Catholic. She never boasted, but I found after she had passed how much she had done for many people out of love, and I think that love came also from her religion. Well, that's just a side story.
No, it's fascinating.
After my second book, which was on the use of history by the Catholic and the Protestant churches in Hungary in the 19th and 20th century, still in Germany, that was my habilitation. So I wrote that still as a mostly secular historian with some distance towards. I think I had more sympathies for the Protestant churches, the Calvinists in Hungary. It changed later on. I then worked more on communism in Hungary for my third book, Hungary since 1945. And there was another project I did, which was about Catholic youth groups during the communist period, and especially in the early 1970s. So I had to read a lot of interrogations by the political police in Hungary, in communist Hungary, and I was very impressed by what these priests and young people who were in forbidden youth groups, what they had to say.
Wow.
So very slowly I became from a scholar of Catholicism more interested, and then in Berlin, still when I lived in Berlin, I became a Catholic. And the personality of Cardinal Mincenti, I heard from my father about him. My father was also a very convinced anti-communist, and when I was young, I didn't fully understand him. I still, when it came to military service or not, that was a time in the mid-1980s when in West Germany, most young people already did their civil service instead of military service, because they thought, it's better to work in a hospital instead of doing military service. So there was a strong pacifism in Germany at the time. But I thought, no, this is not right. Mostly because I thought in the time of Hitler, if people would have said, oh, we rather work in a hospital, then who would have fought against Hitler? So that was my idea. There's evil powers in the world, so you have to have an army and you have to fight. And of course, nowadays we see that again, unfortunately. So coming back to, so I heard about Mincenty. I was not a strong anti-communist at the time, but I thought that the Soviet Union was not having good intentions and that we should defend ourselves. But my father talked a lot about Cardinal Mincenti. I think he was even the president of a Cardinal Mincenti association in Germany. It was not a very big thing, but he was very proud of that, although he was a Lutheran, like most of my male ancestors. So for him, this was also not a religious figure, but he was the fighter against communism, and my father was right about that. He was not a historian, he was a chemist and an actor, but he was very right about Mincenty, which took me about 25 years to find out myself. That's often your relationship with your parents often takes a while until you can see clearly, I think, at least in my case. For my first book on Hungary, I already encountered Cardinal Mincenti as a historical figure because he was very important in the struggle against communism between 1945 and 1948 when he was arrested in Hungary. He was basically the leader of the anti-communist opposition, because that was after more and more oppositional politicians had been incarcerated.
So it's also interesting. I didn't know much about Hungarian history before reading this biography either. But it's also interesting to read it in the context of recent events when present day Hungary has become something of an object of interest for American Catholic political thinkers, as I'm sure you're aware. So I don't know how much the story of Cardinal Mincenti bears on any of that, but it's just interesting to get some more background since people are debating the merits of the present day Hungarian political arrangement, for instance.
So Mincenti was in the West. He was a big figure until the 1970s and until he passed in 1975, and then a little bit at the end of the 1980s during the so-called Second Cold War under Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. They sometimes refer to Mincenti. Today in the West, Mincenti is basically forgotten. If you would ask any American, you wouldn't hear anyone. Sometimes very old people, they might remember Mincenti, but younger people. In Hungary, it's the opposite. Of course, until 1989, he was a very controversial figure, and the communists tried to claim that he was dangerous. And although in the late 1980s, or already during the 1980s, the regime began to soften, and then there were more tolerance for religion and more tolerance for national ideas. And to some extent, also Mincenti was seen a little bit more, not as black and white anymore, but a little bit more nuanced. And then after 1989, of course, Mincenti became a big symbol of the other Hungary that was suppressed during the communist period. And he's still, I don't think he's a very popular figure today in Hungary, but he's certainly among people who are educated and politically aware. They would all know Mincenti, and of course for the Catholic Church, Mincenti is very important. The canonization process is going on. It's slowly also advancing, and so Mincenti for Hungarians is very important. For Hungarian Catholics even more. You will see his portrait in many churches, in parishes. You would hear the Catholic Church academies, the Catholic University in Hungary. You would hear a lot about Mincenti. So he's a figure that has become more important now than before.
I see. Well, so one of the key things about understanding this man is understanding his role as the Prince Primate of Hungary, a figure that, a title of even primate, let alone Prince Primate, that is unfamiliar to Westerners, generally speaking. Maybe if you've studied Polish history, you might be familiar with it. So can you give us a background so that the listeners can have a frame of reference in understanding the Hungary that Mincenti was born into and the role that he was brought into as the Prince Primate eventually?
Well, Hungary was founded as a kingdom in the 11th century. Around 1000, King Saint Stephen received the crown from the Pope. And that made him one of the Christian princes of Europe. Before that, Hungary were basically nomadic tribes. They had a pagan system, but they didn't have a state in the sense of a European state. So the Kingdom of Hungary begins in the year 1000 with the Catholic Church. So the Archbishop of Esztergom, the first bishop, the primate, he was basically also the person that would crown the king or the queen of Hungary. So symbolically, he was basically giving the power of transferring the power of God to the king or queen, to the head of state. And this theory of statehood based on Christianity and on the Catholic Church, this was basically continued until the last king, the blessed Charles IV, or Charles of Austria-Hungary, the last emperor king, who passed away in the 1920s. So there was this strong tradition. After Charles, Hungary was a kingdom without a king. There's this joke, and it was headed by an admiral without a fleet, Admiral Horthy. Horthy was a Calvinist, so there was a crack in the continuity, because usually the kings and queens were all Catholic in Hungarian history. And he was a regent, so he was not a king. He didn't have the aristocratic glory that the real kings, the Habsburg or the other kings before had. So there was already some kind of disconnect, and Mincenty, as a priest in Zalaegerszeg in the province in the west, and also as a bishop of Veszprém towards the end of World War II, he was very critical of the regime of Horthy, because he was a legitimist. He said, no, this is not right. The Habsburg king is the legitimate king. And later on, he met and conversed with Otto Habsburg, the heir to the throne. So somehow Cardinal Mincenti was also in opposition to the regime that was in place between 1920 and 1944, until the German army occupied Hungary and an extreme right-wing regime took power for a couple of months before they were defeated by the Red Army, and then Hungary was occupied by Soviet troops. So for Mincenty, he said, I'm loyal to the 1,000 year or almost 900 something year tradition of the Hungarian kingdom. However, most people in Hungary at the time thought, well, this is broken. And then in 1946, a republic was declared. So Hungary was not a kingdom anymore. But since Mincenty, he was always a very stubborn person. He said, I'm not accepting this. I'm the Prince Primate. I'm basically serving the old Hungarian tradition, the real nation, and what is happening now is basically a deviation from our tradition, our national tradition. This is not Hungary anymore.
So as Prince Primate, he viewed himself as having constitutionally the authority to appoint a new government in the absence of a legitimate government, right? Or to be something like a regent himself in emergency situations.
Well, I'm not sure about that, because Mincenty would sometimes claim, yes, he's a Prince Primate, but the Prince Primate never had the authority to nominate a government or something like that. That was, the Prince Primate only functioned as a constitutional figure when there was a kingdom and a king. Since there was no kingdom, no king, some people, very few people in Hungary thought, okay, then the Prince Primate should be the head of state. But this was very contested, even among conservatives. So this is, and I don't really know whether Mincenty himself really believed in that.
Interesting.
I mean, what he said was the communist regime is illegitimate. It's not legitimate because it's based on an occupation army, the Soviet occupational army.
Mm-hmm.
That's why there is a vacuum. And so I'm the last, basically, constitutional figure of the old tradition.
Yeah.
So that's
the closest thing to a legitimate authority.
Exactly. I mean, but it was not clearly defined what authority the Prince Primate would have. So Cardinal Mincenti just said, well, there's no other legitimate authority, according to the old tradition. But most Hungarians at the time said, there is no more old tradition, we are now a republic.
Right. And at a certain point, Rome itself makes new rules such that prelates can no longer have political positions, but he doesn't know that because he's not getting news from Rome. So he doesn't find out, he doesn't stop using the title Prince Primate for himself and just go to regular primate for quite a while after that happens. So can we step back and just give us a picture of Mincenti's personality and what kind of pastor he was, say, before he gets involved as a national figure?
Yeah, I mean, most of his life, he was a priest in a provincial town, Zalaegerszeg, in the west, towards the Austrian border. He was a great organizer. He, under his priesthood, many schools were opened. He worked with the press. He took care of a newspaper. He was also politically engaged already during the Horthy period. And
that was normal for priests in Hungary at the time. No?
No, it was not. No, he was very exceptional in that. He was very, let's say, he was a complicated character. He was very strict. And a lot of people were afraid of him. He would slap people if they wouldn't come to church on Sunday, if he would see them in the street. So he was like Don Camillo in the film, Don Camillo and Pepone in Italy, a very popular movie where you have a priest that is also sometimes boxing with a communist. And so that's Mincy. He was one like that. He didn't shy away from violence sometimes. He was very clear about the priorities, but he was as I said, a very well organized and organizing priest. So he created a lot of institutions for the Catholics in his region, and that's also one of the reasons why he became a Monsignor and then later Bishop of Veszprém, 1941.
It seems as though he was a really
although he was almost 50 years old by then. And as a bishop of Veszprém, he continued this work, creating schools, works for poor people. So he was very active as a priest, very outspoken. And then, of course, in 1944, the first time he was imprisoned was by the right-wing Arrow Cross fascist party. Because he was so critical of the war, he said the war has to stop. You will destroy the country. You have to stop the war openly. And so they put him in prison.
And that first imprisonment was just a couple of months, right? Yes,
because that's when the Soviets were already in the eastern part of Hungary, and soon the fascists and the German troops were fleeing the country. It was towards end of 1944.
Now, you said that he was unusual in his political involvement as a priest, but was he also an outlier among Hungarian prelates in his political views, in his views on legitimism and such?
Well, probably not. But for example, Seredi, who was the primate before Mincenty, he passed away in 1945. He was a very different figure. He was a scholar. He was a very diplomatic. He was for a long time in Rome. Mincenty was never in Rome. He had the chance to go to Rome when he was very young, but he didn't want to go. He wanted to stay at home. And the bishop who mentored him was a little bit disappointed about that. But Mincenty, I think he shared many of his ideas, of the ideas about legitimism with other priests. We don't know exactly because we don't have any polls or something like that. But what was different about him was that he was outspoken. Charity and other priests and other bishops were much more reluctant to speak out politically. So he was very different in regard of his temperament, his bravery also.
So it seems as though Mincenty was an attentive pastor. He was personally an ascetic and perhaps expected too much of that from others as well. He tended to impose that on, the other people with whom he lived as a bishop, for instance. But very devout, not just a political mover, but also very concerned about the good of the souls for which he cared. But of course, he became known primarily as a figure of opposition to communism. So you mentioned that the Red Army comes in and occupies Hungary, but it's not immediately a full-on communist state, right? It starts out as a republic at the beginning of 1946. And so what were his relations with the republic?
Well, it starts at the end of 1944. There was a temporary government that was a coalition government that included various political parties, the communists, Social Democrats, various liberal parties, and then there was a big party that also won the first elections, the Smallholders Party, which was basically an agrarian populist party that was not communist, and that's why they got a huge majority at the end of 1944 during the first free elections. Some parties were banned, and some Christian parties were also considered to be, by the communists, to be right-wing, and then they were excluded. But the smallholder parties basically represented the whole 2/3 of Hungary that were against communism and against the Social Democrats. And but this party was destroyed step by step by the communists and helped by the Soviet army. It was a slow process. In 1948, that's when they basically built up the Stalinist, really harsh dictatorship in Hungary with hundreds of thousands of people in labor camps, oppositional people tortured and killed, and then also an assault at the Catholic Church with hundreds of priests and nuns and monks persecuted, killed, put in labor camps. Almost all monasteries and convents were dissolved, and so it was a brutal attack, and that was in 1948. And the trial against József Mincenty in 1949 was also used as a propaganda tool to justify the violence against the Catholic Church in Hungary. So that went hand in glove, 1948, 1949. The period between Mincenty was critical, but he also offered his, as a Prince Primate or a Primate, he also offered his cooperation to the first governments. So the conflict slowly built up between Mincenty and the new regime. And in 1947-48, he also, after a trip to Canada and after he was in Rome and he had became a cardinal, he took on the purple. He organized mass rallies around Saint Mary. He declared one year to be the year of Saint Mary, and he said Saint Mary is the patron saint of Hungary. So we have to go back to Saint Mary. We have to go back to our national traditions. He gave speeches that were followed by hundreds of thousands of people. And the communists, the only way to stop him, they found, was to arrest him. And that happened in Christmas 1948. And then they claimed that he wanted to overthrow the government and go back to the Habsburg regime, which was absurd because, of course, he did not plan anything like that. But, of course, it was a very typical Stalinist trial with falsified documents, with tortured witnesses, etc.
Yeah, he had to, he had his views on legitimism, but he clearly was not really involved in any intrigue to actually restore the throne. He understood that was not practical.
Yes, no, that's absurd. I mean, the thing that he did was he told Hungarians, don't forget your roots, don't forget your tradition, don't forget who you are as Hungarians. Right. And that was enough to say, don't follow the communists.
Right. Now, it seems like a lot of people perceived Mincenty as a possible future martyr from an earlier point, especially after the Red Army occupation. When Pius XII creates him as a cardinal along with 31 others, he says to him, "Of the 32, you will be the first to suffer the martyrdom whose symbol this red color is." And people around him, even in their frustration with his rigid personality at times, understood that he was a valuable fighter against communism. His vicar describes him humorously as a submachine gun primate sent by God for a time in which fighting would be necessary, for instance.
Yeah, although the question of martyrdom is a little bit contested, because in 1956, in November, after he was liberated by some Hungarian troops that were loyal to the revolution, the anti-communist revolution, he wasn't sure what to do. So he could have stayed, and the communists would have had to deal with him. It wasn't clear what they would have done. But instead he went to the US embassy, and some people thought that's not martyrdom. Right. But I mean, I'm not judging. It's just, I don't know. I mean, but he was very brave as long as he could, and he remained very brave. So as there is a certain martyrdom, of course, in his life.
So he's in prison for 8 years, from 1948 to 1956. Is that right?
Exactly.
And
yes.
So he's in bad conditions for a lot of that time. He's beaten, especially in interrogations. They try to coerce him to sign various admissions of guilt, and he in fact does admit certain wrongdoing in a sort of general, vague sense at his trial. Under mental weakness and duress, I think we can understand, yes. Which he later repudiates to a certain extent. And then in 1956, there's this sort of temporary revolution, this very short-lived revolution. And shortly after that, the Soviets send people to quell this revolutionary government and reestablish Soviet control. And he makes this split, this decision in the moment to go to the US Legation in Hungary. And he stays there for 15 years, which nobody would have expected at, the day that he arrived there. But it's one of the more unusual aspects of his life is that he stays in this U.S., this cardinal of the Catholic Church stays in this U.S. legation for 15 years and essentially in isolation from the rest of the world because they agree to take him in, but basically under the conditions that he can't have much outside contact with anybody, either in the Vatican, in the United States, or in Hungary itself, because they know that they don't have the resources to defend themselves against a Soviet attack. So basically, in order to avoid provoking a Soviet attack, the U.S. Diplomats themselves had to prevent him from doing anything but communication of a religious or personal nature with the outside world.
Yeah. His mother were allowed to visit him,
right,
several times, but he was very isolated.
And throughout this period,
but he did learn English at the time, and write many letters.
But most of them aren't reaching anybody. He's writing to different U.S. presidents, to all sorts of different people, but in vain. And he's isolated, and it seems to have a strange effect on him. A number of people who got to know him at the Legation described him as being to somewhat out of touch with reality or with the political reality of what was going on, understandably, and not really understanding what his role was anymore.
Yeah, and I think what we have to understand is also that he was, and that was something that brought him into conflict also with Paul VI later on,
right.
That he was more concerned, sometimes it seemed, with Hungary than with the Catholic Church to some extent. Although he was obedient, he remained obedient to the popes and the world church, but he didn't understand how the church was changing during that time, how it became much more a global church since the 1960s. And he didn't understand the Second Vatican Council. I think that was and he was more and more focusing on Hungary. What does this mean for Hungary? And that was a problem for the popes, because the pope said, well, we have to look at the whole picture. I think that was a part of the tragedy to some extent.
Well, it's interesting to look at the changing attitudes of the Vatican towards the communist East and towards the Mincenti situation in particular, because, for example, in Margit Balog's book, she cites John the 23rd as having expressed his disapproval, sympathetic disapproval of Mincenti's decision to not stay in Hungary but to go to the U.S. legation. He thought that it should have been his role to suffer whatever he had to suffer with his people. And it was an odd situation too, because in terms of as the Hungarian government saw it, he was no longer in Hungary, but canonically speaking, he was still considered to be in Hungary. So he was still residing in Hungary as the primate in terms of the canonical region that he was in. But he couldn't actually do anything, so they had to appoint, apostolic administrators and things like that to act in his stead. But then by the time, as you mentioned, by the time you get to Pope Paul VI, there are certain respects in which the situation has thawed, and the church is less concerned with resisting the communist governments and more concerned with just carving out a space for the Catholic Church to exist in these communist nations diplomatically. And so Mincenty increasingly appears to be a bit of a throwback to an older approach and a pre-Vatican II approach. And although viewed with sympathy and respect by many high-ranking church officials, and certainly by all of the popes under which he lived, he is also viewed as somewhat of a diplomatic conundrum at the same time.
Yeah, that's correct. For the church, of course, it was important to fill there were vacant seats more and more in Hungary, and they had to find some way to fill these with new bishops. And they knew that the communists had started to infiltrate the church, and some priests were also corrupted by the secret police, and that was very difficult. But somehow the church had to continue, and it had to have bishops in place and priests, and so that was a problem. And Mincenty seemed to completely ignore that. He said, "We don't negotiate with the communists, no matter what the costs." Of course, practically that was creating more and more problems for the survival of the church to some extent. Although morally it was, of course, justified.
Do you think in the period leading up to the Stalinization of Hungary, in the period leading up to his second arrest and his trial, he's obviously to be admired for his staunch opposition to communism and I think in particular for his understanding, probably ahead of his time, that the communists simply could not be trusted in negotiations, which is something I think that we saw a shift from the Ostpolitik of John the 23rd and Paul VI to the policy of Pope St. John Paul II, who was more encouraging various forms of peaceful resistance to communism. But do you think that there's a suggestion in this book that Mincenti's personality and his sort of uncompromising nature led him to be less effective in helping the church in Hungary than he could have been in the years leading up to his arrest? Do you think that there's something to that?
It's very hard to say, because we don't really know what would have happened if he would have been more willing to compromise with the communists. And we know that from the example of Wyszynski in Poland, for example, that even more diplomatic bishops or primates, they were also they could not prevent the Stalinization of the country, the assault on the church. It's very hard to say. On the other hand, of course, in Hungary, the persecution of the church was extremely harsh, much harsher than in other Eastern European countries. There was a big difference. But we don't know whether that had to do with Mincenty or with the fact that in Hungary there was much more resistance to the communist regime compared to other places, which is also testimony is also 1956, the revolution. We don't have that in other places, an armed revolt against the communist regime. So, yeah, as a historian, I always see personalities are very important, but we have to see the context in which they act, and that kind of relativizes the question about what if Mincenty would have been more diplomatic. Would it probably not much difference?
Yeah, so it is interesting that you frequently see complaints from his peers as to his what they perceive to be his sort of his failure to adjust to circumstances in many situations, including his fellow bishops. And notably, the fellow Hungarian bishops don't make any public protest when he's arrested in 1948, which I thought was very striking. In fact, and other leaders of other religious groups even condemned him publicly in order to...
I couldn't hear the last...
Leaders of other religious groups in Hungary, such as various Protestant denominations and Jewish leaders, condemned him publicly in order to keep the agreements that they had made with the government at the time.
Well, there was also, the Jewish leaders, there was also the problem that Mincenty, to some extent, did not express much about the Holocaust, which was very terrible in Hungary. 500, almost 600,000 Jews were killed only within a few months in 1944. Yeah. And I think there might have been some disappointment about that, that he did not really express anything about that.
On the other hand, he did object to the deportation of Jews, did he not?
No, he did not. No, no, I mean, he was critical of the right-wing regime, but he protested. He was arrested because he protested that the war went on, and he said, we have to stop the war. He did not protest the deportation. He later protested the deportation of the German minority from Hungary, which was also a very brutal persecution.
My understanding is that he had at least protested the deportation of Jews who had converted to Catholicism and made the argument that
that's true, but not the Holocaust as such.
I see.
Yeah.
So, where do we go from here? So he is, like we said, he's in this this legation for 15 years. And at what point, is it even earlier than that he starts to become an international symbol?
Yeah, I mean, he's a symbol in 1948 when he's arrested. There's demonstrations all over the world, in Rome, of course, organized by the Vatican, but all over the Western world, in Australia, in Latin America, in the United States, everywhere there's protests against, because that was a symbol of religious persecution. And 1948, that's also the time when in Hollywood there's a lot of movies like Ben-Hur, Quo Vadis, where it's about the persecution of Christians. And I think people understood, all right, something like this is going on in Eastern Europe right now. So I think that's it was a big thing, 1948, and then again 1956,
right,
when he comes out and he gives a speech on the radio, and then again in 1971 when he comes out of the legation embassy at the time. Then when he comes to Rome, he's like a living testimony of the earlier phase of the Cold War then. So I mean, there's always these phases when he is in the world media, when you can read about him everywhere. 1948, 49, 1956, and then again 1971, 1975 when he passes.
And in the 50s, there are two movies made about him. One of them is explicitly about him. I think that was in 1955. And then there was another one, a better known one today, called The Prisoner in 1950, in which Alec Guinness played a situation very similar to his. We could say based on his situation.
Yeah, and Guinness would later convert to Catholicism.
That's right.
Which I like about the movie. The second movie, the Alec Guinness movie, it was a little bit more. It was more about psychology. That it was mostly about, okay, how come that someone who has such a strong will is broken by his torturers? That's mostly what it's about. And the other movie is more about, it's earlier. It's I think 1952, and that's it was considered to be a propaganda movie. It's not the greatest movie of all times, but it's a little bit more superficial, you could say.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about his time in the U.S. Legation in Hungary. And as you mentioned, people think that the question of him being a white martyr is complicated by his choice to go to the Legation in 1956, something which some of the revolutionaries of the time felt he had sort of betrayed them or abandoned them by going there. And he himself was very conflicted about it, although he refused to leave when U.S. authorities and Vatican authorities were trying to convince him to do so over the next decade and a half. Can you tell me a bit about what he felt he was accomplishing in remaining there for so long?
Well, most of all, he said he's doing this for the Hungarian nation. He felt that he was maybe a little bit exaggeratedly that he was really the voice of the real Hungarian nation, that he represented it in a time when there was an illegitimate government. And so I think he felt, and that was when the conflict with the Vatican, or the misunderstanding with the Vatican, also became deeper, because for the Vatican this was not so relevant, this idea of is he the representative of the Hungarian nation. That was, of course, not important for the Catholic Church. It was more a political thing, not a religious. So I guess that's how they understood it. But he saw himself more and more just serving the nation of Hungary. Mm-hmm. And that's why he thought he can't leave. He said, if I leave, then Hungary is lost to the communists.
How did it come about that he was finally convinced to leave?
That's complicated. I think it was because 15 long years were a long time. So he was very old. He only lived 4 more years after he left the embassy. So I guess he felt something has to happen. And of course, in the embassy, they were concerned that he would die in the embassy, and that would have been complicated. Then there was a Hungarian priest from Rome, who convinced him that he could do much for the Hungarian diaspora if he would leave. And I think that was something that was important, that the Pope told him, you have still a task to fulfill for all the Hungarians outside of Hungary. There's so many. And that's what he then put on. But for Mincenty, also important was to publish his memoirs. And that was another question that was kind of contested between him and the Vatican. They didn't want him to publish his memoirs. Then he just did it. And that's when the Pope basically replaced him.
Yeah.
And
it seems as though one of the big sticking points in his delaying leaving the legation was that in the Hungarian government's terms to allow him to leave the country safely was that he would basically not raise his voice against the Hungarian government or interfere even verbally in Hungarian affairs ever again. And so they had to get some kind of guarantee from the Vatican that he would keep silent, which of course he wasn't willing to give.
No.
And it was only when you know, their terms relaxed somewhat that he was able to leave.
And the Vatican tried to silence him to some extent, but of course they couldn't. I mean, they had no. Yeah, there was no. But the problem was mostly the memoirs, and that's when the final conflict with the Paul VI broke out about the memoirs. But then, I don't know. I mean, in hindsight, you would think the memoirs were a big event, because it was published in German and English and then in other languages. It was a bestseller. And of course it talks about his being tortured and everything. I think, but in the long run, I think, I don't know, it didn't harm the communist regime much, because that was things that people knew. So somehow I think in the end, there was a lot, I don't know, I shouldn't say too much fuss about nothing, but it was not such a, how should I say, not really a big damage that was caused for the communists by this publication, I think.
He was convinced that his memoirs were like the last big thing that he could do for his country, essentially. Yes. Publishing his memoirs would be very important. And the Hungarian government also didn't want to allow that to happen. So they also thought that it would be harmful. And then the Vatican, having arrived at this more conciliatory approach, this more negotiation-based approach with the communist world, was afraid that the publication of these memoirs would basically just be a wrench in the works, preventing diplomatic relations. So he's treated with respect by the Vatican leadership and by every pope of the period of his life. But there is, let's say, Pope Paul VI tries to be as diplomatic as possible in encouraging him to leave, and he eventually does leave the legation, comes to Rome, and then settles in Vienna. But also in encouraging him to resign as the archbishop. And that is something that Mincenty had no interest in doing. So can you talk about the dynamic here between Paul VI and Mincenty?
Yes, I mean, as I said before, for Paul VI, it was important that they could basically replace or nominate new bishops and also a new primate. That was very important for them so that the administration of the church could continue. So it was very practical ideas. But Mincenty thought that would be treason. And somehow he was not open for these practical considerations. He saw everything very much in principle, as questions of principle. So this gap between the two expectations widened over time. I think it was painful for the Pope that he had to depose Mincenty eventually, also because Mincenty just went on with publishing the memoirs even against the expressed will of the Pope. So I think that was the dynamic. It was tragic because I don't think that Pope Paul VI wanted to damage Mincenty, and he was criticized heavily for that. There was a lot of critique of the deposition of Mincenty.
Do you think that it's been unfair the way that people have portrayed the Vatican as having sacrificed Mincenty?
I think so, because what is the Pope doing? I mean, he needs to have bishops, and the church. One of the major tasks of the church is that people can get communion when they need it, so that you need priests. And I mean, that's the problem. Even if these priests are compromised because they work for the secret police or something like that, which some Hungarian priests unfortunately did, they are still priests. Mm-hmm. That's so I understand the Vatican's position.
Right.
But of course, morally, you can understand Mincenty and his followers.
Right.
It's a tragic situation.
Yeah. It probably is worth mentioning that Mincenty, at the time that, his see was declared vacant by Rome, he was 82. So he had already well passed the normal time of retirement at 75, and then the time when you're really supposed to retire if you haven't already at age 80. And at this point, because he wasn't able to do anything in Hungary, he was not only a symbol, he was a symbol, but he was basically just that. He was a symbol because he didn't have any practical governance over his see.
Well, to some extent, he considered himself the shepherd of the Hungarian diaspora, which was widespread.
Yes, but he was able to continue to do that after he had been deposed as well, so that didn't hurt him in that respect.
No, he traveled the world. He went to Australia, New Zealand, he went to South Africa, he went to Latin America, to Venezuela. So he went to many places where there was a Hungarian diaspora and visited them. And for them, it was wonderful. Also in the United States, when he visited, it was a big thing when he was in Cleveland with a big Hungarian population, Buffalo, New York, and places like that. That was really big. And so I think for the Hungarian diaspora, it was very important. That should not be underrated.
Well, to sum up, and this conversation has been necessarily an overview because so many things happen in his life, and the book that recently came out is 675 pages, so it's very, very detailed. But what do you think that we can learn from studying Mincenty for today's problems in the church and the way the church relates to geopolitics?
Well, as a historian, of course, I see that that necessary dilemma between moral ideas and practical ideas. But I mean, if we look at Ukraine today and the really brave resistance against a brutal Russian intervention, of course, the first thing I thought was 1956, that the tanks are rolling in. So Ukraine, I think they show that we still need people like Mincenty who are brave and they defend principles and they defend the church and religion. I think that's very important. It's a tragedy that Russia tries to justify its aggression by religious ideas. But I think if we look at the longer history, of course, we can see that the Orthodox Church was always trying to destroy the Catholic Church. The Habsburg Empire was defending those Orthodox in Ukraine, the Uniates, who were loyal to the Pope against Russian aggression. It's hundreds of years going back to this conflict. So there's also a religious side. And of course, the Vatican now tries to kind of be diplomatic and like always.
Well, I think if I got anything from reading this book, and the amount of detail that the author gives about all the back and forth and the little adjustments in diplomacy over the years, for instance, in the Vatican trying to deal with Hungary and see whether we can get the Archbishop out of here. I think that it will probably make me a little more hesitant to in matters of diplomacy, especially when not all the information is made public at the time, to make facile judgments about the way different nations handle these matters. It's easy to say, well, why didn't they stand up for so and so? And maybe that's true, but there's so many complex issues that are involved in these things, and sometimes it's just not prudent to take what would appear to be, from a simple perspective, a principled stand. I mean, you can take a principled stand, but that doesn't solve the problem of, as you said, getting people communion at the end of the day in a situation where there simply is no short-term possibility of overthrowing a Soviet government, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, that's the tragedy of Pius XII and the Holocaust, that he's always been portrayed as this Hitler's Pope, which is horrible, and it's so wrong. But it's people who think, the Pope should just give declarations all the time that are morally sound. But this is not how the world functions, unfortunately. But what I think we also learn is, the Catholic Church, they need martyrs, but not everyone can be a martyr. It's more complicated. It needs very different approaches, and only if we have different approaches, the whole thing can survive, I think.
Yeah. And both people, both sorts of people need to understand and respect the other, I think. which is maybe if there's any fault that we see in Mincenty, in reading this book, it's maybe that he is not super quick to understand the perspective of other people who share his basic values and share his Catholic principles.
That's true. But if you look at how Paul VI and Mincenty treated each other, you see there was a lot of respect on both sides.
Yes. And certainly he was very, you can talk about, yes, he did publish his memoirs against the Pope's wishes, but, it's not that as though that's a canonical crime, either. And ultimately he was obedient to Rome. Yes. So I wanted to ask, though, I read that you have a project on devotion to Fatima that you're working on. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, and I saw that you have a podcast about Fatima.
I did, yeah.
Recently. Yeah, I mean, what I'm interested in is, I just gave a talk about that in Israel last week. I was at this conference in Tel Aviv. So what I'm interested in is how Fatima is, on the one hand, a Portuguese national cult, and at the same time a global phenomenon, and then also how Portuguese colonialism played a role in the spread of Fatima, because in the beginning the statues are going to Angola, Mozambique, all the colonies, Macau.
Oh, interesting.
And so it's a fascinating history. It also shows the globalization of Catholicism, because it goes to around the globe, to New Guinea.
Right.
So that's what I'm interested in. It's still a very broad project, and I have to find a way to kind of make it workable.
Well, Arpad, thank you very much for coming on the show to introduce my listeners to this important 20th century Catholic figure. And again, the book, for people who are interested in reading more, is Victim of History, published by Catholic University of America Press. I'll link to that in the description of this episode. For all those who've been watching on YouTube, please do subscribe. If you'd like to help us continue our work, you can always go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio. We do appreciate any contribution that you can make. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.